Something unusual just happened. Sweden and Ukraine signed a letter of intent for the transfer of up to 150 Gripen fighter jets. It wasn't a flashy announcement, no CNN ticker, no war room theatrics. But in my view, this is one of the most significant defense developments of the year, and maybe not for the reasons you would expect. Because this is not just about Ukraine's Air Force. It's not even just about Sweden's growing industrial power. Canada is now circling this deal, not just as a potential buyer, but as a possible manufacturer. And in this channel, we've talked a lot about boosting Canada's production capabilities. Now, if this sounds like a technicality, I'd ask you to stay with me, because when a country shifts from buying weapons to building them, we're no longer talking about defense policy, we're talking about industrial identity, sovereignty, literal leverage. What I want to do with this video is unpack three things. Why this fighter jet deal could reshape Ukraine's war, not years from now, but in the near term. How Sweden is quietly positioning itself as a defense power inside NATO, not with soldiers, but with factories. And why Canada's possible role in this story might be the most geopolitically important part, not because of the jets themselves, but because of the industrial shift behind them. Because when countries start rewiring who builds what, who funds what, and who controls the supply chain, it always eventually comes back to ordinary people, to jobs, to taxes, to the cost of living, to whether your government orders tools or makes them. And in my view, defense decisions only look distant. They're actually always paid for up close. Before we go deeper, I want to mention something connected to today's topic. I've just released Awake, a book about how to think clearly when the world is noisy, when decisions are made far above our heads, and when the consequences arrive quietly months or years later. It's for everyone who feels that clarity, not speed, is the real modern superpower. If you want to sharpen the way that you interpret stories like this, where policy, economics, war, and industry overlap, the book is available now with a 10% launch discount for this weekend. The link is below if you want to explore that further, with a launch video as well. But now let's look at what the Sweden-Ukraine deal really is, what's confirmed, what's still a question mark, and why Canada may be on the edge of a decision that could define the next decade of its aerospace future. Let's start with the basics. On October 22nd, 2025, Sweden became the backdrop for a significant moment. Ukraine and Sweden signed a formal letter of intent. We're not talking a binding contract yet, but this is a serious commitment. The scope was between 100 and 150 Saab JAS-39 Gripen E fighter jets built by Saab AB. If this deal finalizes, it would be the largest aircraft export order in Sweden's history. Here's why I think the aircraft matters in a deeper way. The Gripen E is tailor-made for the kind of war Ukraine is fighting. It's built for contested airspace, for taking off from damaged airways, for resilience essentially. One piece noted that the Gripen can operate from round airstrips and is a solid low-cost alternative to more expensive fifth-generation jets. Now, in my view, this means that this is not about luxury or symbolism, but rather about Ukraine's survival. And this is where I want to highlight the shift itself, that this deal isn't just about flying more sorties, it's a rebuild of Ukraine's entire Air Force philosophy, moving from a patchwork of Soviet-era jets and ad hoc upgrades to a modern NATO-aligned ecosystem. An Air Force that not just builds flights, but trains, maintains, and scales. That's a less visible but more profound change. But, and this is crucial, the deal is not sealed yet, not even close. We're still in the exploratory stage here, which raises all sorts of industrial, logistical, and financial questions. And that's why I started paying attention to Canada. Now, I think most people assume a country like Canada's defense strategy is permanently tethered to the US, that the F-35 Lightning II was inevitable, and that Canada's role would be solidly fixed buyer, not builder. Let me pause for a moment to explain what I mean by buyer versus builder here. A buyer simply will sign a contract, put in the money, and the jets or ships or whatever will arrive assembled and ready. A builder means the country manufactures components, final assemble systems, maintains the long term, maybe even exports, so the country itself becomes a part of the industrial chain and not just the end user. Now, this deal for the JAS-39 Gripen E cracks the assumption open. Saab AB has made it very clear that if Canada chooses the Gripen, they're willing to build them in Canada. They're not just sales talking here. On their Canadian website, they state the aircraft would be built, maintained, and upgraded in Canada together with our Canadian partners, quote, and that line, built, maintained, upgraded in Canada, has a lot of meaning. Built means final assembly happens on Canadian soil, meaning parts come in, technicians assemble the jets. Maintained implies that long-term upkeep, repairs, parts, service is done in Canada, which means that jobs stay local. Upgraded means that as the jet evolves, radar updates, weapon changes, Canada doesn't just receive the changes, they actually help implement them. That includes Canadian industry names like IMP Aerospace and Defense, and even Bombardier. Here's where it starts to get interesting though, because Canada hasn't signed anything yet, but talks are ongoing. And meanwhile, Saab says that the Ukrainian deal, up to 150 Gripens, would force it to double its production capacity. And that makes sense, because 150 jets would be the largest aircraft export order in Sweden's history. Most Gripen customers buy in much smaller batches. Brazil ordered 36, Hungary flies 14, the Czech Republic 14 as well. Even the Swedish Air Force itself only operates around 90. So 150 is actually a massive number when it comes to these kinds of planes. It's not just a sale, it's an industrial upheaval. That creates a space for new assembly lines, and I think Canada sees this as an opportunity, which it is, not just to receive aircraft, but to be part of the supply chain for Ukraine's war effort too. When you shift from we'll buy the planes to we'll build the planes, the strategic logic changes. Canada goes from being a peripheral customer to an industrial partner, and that matters economically, jobs, high-tech manufacturing, and it matters geopolitically as well, less dependency, more autonomy. Now, for a country like Canada, a country that's long outsourced its defense muscle, this is more than a procurement shift. It's a chance to rebuild airspace sovereignty, to reimagine what participation in global defense looks like, not just by writing checks, but by welding, assembling, and exporting. If this happens, Canadian firms would go from spectators of this thing to stakeholders in the most urgent defense supply chain in the world right now. And that comes with power and with a little bit of risk. This kind of involvement links you politically, economically, and morally to the outcomes. If Canada becomes a part of the pipeline that arms Ukraine, it's no longer an observer, it's a contributor. And I think that matters because it signals a shift in how smaller Western nations assert themselves, not just through alliance, but through capacity. So why am I spending this much time on a jet contract that hasn't even been signed? Because I think it reflects something deeper, and that's a realignment, not just of air power, but of trust, industrial capacity, and who gets to shape the future. And sometimes it's these quiet moments, a letter of intent, a production quote, the signal a bigger shift is underway. For Ukraine, this is not just about surviving Russian attacks, but about building a post-war air force. Not patchwork aircraft, not something borrowed, but something coherent, trained, modern. It's a declaration of intent that we're staying. For Sweden, it's about finally pushing their Gripen back into relevance. Saab has been on the export sidelines for years, but this, if it happens, could reposition Sweden inside NATO as more than just a partner, but rather as a producer with real industrial leverage. And for Canada, if it plays this right, this could be a pivot point. The moment it stops being simply a buyer of American systems or a junior partner in someone else's strategy and becomes something closer to an industrial ally, a country that builds, exports, maintains, a country with its own airspace ecosystems, not just access to somebody else's. I don't say that to overhype this. I know the deal isn't done. Canada still looks committed to the F-35, and it's hard to imagine a clean reversal of that path. But I also think doors don't just swing open all at once. Sometimes it starts with a quote, a conversation, and sometimes one crisis, unfortunately, Ukraine's, becomes the moment another country sees itself differently. That's why I'm watching this. Not because I expect everything will change tomorrow, but because I think that the possibility of change here is enough to warrant attention. Now, look, I don't know if this deal will be finalized. I don't know if Canada will choose Gripen. These are still live wires, but I do know this. Countries that can build their own tools tend to shape their own futures. And if Canada chooses to build for itself or for Ukraine, that decision may matter far beyond the production line. As always, thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What do you think, though? Should Canada pursue Gripen manufacturing? Is this a smart move or a geopolitical gamble? If this kind of strategic shift interests you, the quieter forces behind global power, I think you'd get a lot from my book Awake. It's about how to think clearly when headlines move fast, but consequences unfold slowly. When a letter of intent in Sweden might reshape air power in Ukraine, defense industry in Canada, and geopolitical leverage across the West. Awake is for anyone who wants to understand the systems behind the story and how to stay rooted, informed, and sharp as those systems involve. The 10% launch discount ends this weekend. I've linked it below if you'd like to take a look. Thank you for watching it. If you'd like to explore this further, check out these other videos that I've linked here as the natural next step. Until next time, stay nuanced and stay awake.